Greetings, friends. I'm Marc David, founder of the Institute for the Psychology of Eating. Here we are back in the Psychology of Eating podcast. From time to time, I love to interview a wonderful expert in the field of eating psychology, nutrition, health, personal transformation. And I'm with Elise Museles today, certified eating psychology and nutrition expert. Welcome, Elise.
Hi, Marc. It's so good to be here with you today.
It really is. Let me just take a minute and just brag about you to our audience, and then we can jump in. So I wanted to share with you all that Elise is the best-selling author of Food Story, Rewrite the Way You Eat, Think, and Live. Elise holds 4 certificates in holistic health and integrative healing. She's on the Environmental Working Group Board of Directors and has been an NIH grant recipient for 5 years in a row. Elise is a sought-after speaker. She's also the host of her own popular podcast called Once Upon a Food Story. Her work has been featured in Oprah Magazine, Forbes, Health, Self, ELLE, Well&Good, Chalkboard, mindbodygreen, Yoga Journal, lots of other great places. How long have we known each other, Elise?
Since 2012.
Thanks for having a better memory than me.
Well, you've had a lot of students come through your program, and I haven't had that many mentors, so it's much easier for me to remember.
Well, I am so thrilled to be in conversation with you today. I've had the pleasure of just following your career for a while and just really have enjoyed seeing you just expand your work, your reach, your message, being an author. How about if we start out by just, share about your niche, your specialty in the world of eating and psychology and nutrition. Like, just what's your passion?
My passion, well, first of all, I just want to back up for a minute and just share that I wouldn't be here having this conversation or feeling comfortable in my own skin if it weren't for all the work that you do, and having gone through your program and just learning from you. So I just want to say thank you. And right at the top of the episode, so everybody knows just how impactful you've been in not just my career, but also my own personal journey. So to answer your question, I feel like my niche is really to help people with their mindset around food, because so often we can get the food thing right. We can, put all the, whatever foods, the whole fresh, real foods onto our plate and understand, what is going to nourish our bodies. But we don't pay as much attention to what's going on in our heads. And that's probably the very simplistic way, but it's what holds so many of us back from living our lives. It is what held me back. And I had this soundtrack that played, and I didn't even realize how harmful it was because I got so used to hearing it. It was just part of my everyday, part of my daily routine. And, it was always there. So it wasn't until I did the work, I went through your program and got trained and started unraveling my own food story and realizing how I was seeking perfection and beating myself up, along the way. That was when I decided I had to change, because I spent so many hours unknowingly in my own head instead of living my own life. And I really try to help people get out of that space, and so they can have the freedom to be able to do all the incredible things that we're put on this planet to do.
So I know these days that you're doing your podcast, you've just written a book, you're speaking. Are you still working individually with people? Are you working with groups?
I am working with a handful of people individually, and it's more because of bandwidth that I haven't been seeing as many clients. I am in the middle of creating a course. So that's in the works, because I feel like community is really just so powerful for healing, and that when we share our stories, we feel so much less alone. We realize how we're all connected. And so I really am excited about creating more group experiences. And I do a lot for the environmental working group. I chair the development committee, so that's a huge responsibility. So I spend a lot of my time on that, and just with the book coming out, there's been so much excitement. Just doing press and doing podcasts. So I'm busy. I'm busy sharing my passion.
Good for you. So, food story. I love the term. I love the title, and tell me what that means for you, and tell me what that would mean for a reader reading your book.
I like that question, Mark. So, food story is the messages, all the, well, let me back up for a second. I want to talk about how I really started talking about food story and how the concept became really clear to me. Mm-hmm. So this was after, first I became a certified holistic health coach, and I was really working with people with what was on their plate. And it was great, and I could help some people improve their habits, but I knew that there was a missing piece of what you like to say of the nutrition puzzle. And so then I went through the institute and got certified, in eating psychology or mind body nutrition. And I was so excited to work with people on, not just what they were eating, but also help them with what they were thinking. So I had a lot of clients at that time, and I asked them, so tell me about your relationship with food. And it was like, I asked this horrible question, you could see that their shoulders would go down, or like, oh, whoa, don't talk to me about that. Or just that it was kind of a dead end. And so I realized that I needed to rethink how I was approaching asking people about their relationship with food. And I started to think, well, when you talk about a relationship with food, oftentimes we think about just us and food, but it's so much more dynamic, and it's the messages that you've received over a lifetime, all the meals, all the memories, just all the conversations you've had with people. Just there's villains, there's heroes, there's chapters, plot twists, and there's so much that goes into how you relate to food. So I would start asking people, tell me about your food story. And my clients were like, wow, I never thought about it as a food story. And suddenly it became like almost a way for them to release some of the blame and the shame that they had about it when they realized it was so dynamic, and it wasn't just, I feel bad because I can't do this, or I'm feeling guilty, or, why do I still have this issue? And when they understood there were so many different dimensions to it, it was almost like oh gosh, okay, now I can peel back the layers, but without all that shame. So it just stuck, and it really stuck to talk about it in that way, and to get involved in conversation with so much more than just the food, what the food on your plate, and how you were relating to it. And so that's how the concept of food story. And of course, when I was going through the program at the Institute, you asked us to write out our story, and that was really cathartic. And, that probably laid down the foundation for talking to people about their food story. So that's what it means. I don't know if you have any questions before I go into what it means to me personally, but that's what I want the reader to understand, and the starting place for everyone to know that you do have a food story, even if you don't think you have one. And it's complex.
Yes. I just want to make a comment right now. Story, both of us are parents, and I just so clearly have the memory of being a parent and sitting down with my son or with a bunch of kids and going, okay, it's story time. And as soon as you bring out the word story, okay, I'm going to tell you a story. It's just, everybody is all ears. There's something magical about the word story and about stories themselves, because they can be so amazing. I mean, any movie that you go see is a story. Any TV show that you watch is a story. And we don't always think of our life as a story, and in particular, our relationship with food as a story. So I just love this approach. So tell me more.
Well, the other thing about story, I agree with you that it is magical, and we love hearing stories, and that's what touches our heart. When we hear other people's stories, like look at Humans of New York. It's really just taken off, and they're ordinary people, but who have something extraordinary or something to share that happened to them in their everyday lives. The other thing about story is that it's always evolving. That it can change and evolve as you do, so that it doesn't feel like a dead end. And I love when we talk about food in that way, because you're not stuck. It gives people hope about what they can create and do for the future, or change. So I like that part of story too. So you wanted me to share what food story means to me?
Yes.
I mean, it's the same thing as it is for the reader, but for me, I especially even though I'd done all this work when I worked with you and went through the program, writing the book was really cathartic. There's something about actually putting, like in the old fashioned way, like pen. I wrote the book on my computer, but I would take some notes, in a journal. And there's something about that is so like, you release so much, all that stored up emotions, and you discover so much, because when you just start writing without judgment, things come out of you and you're like, wow, I didn't even realize how meaningful that moment 20 years ago was for me in my food story. And so I feel like for me, food story has also been a way for me to put the pieces together of why I had the story of perfection around food. And I could really understand where it came from when I started, looking back into the origins of my food story. And, you hear the quote, the people say all the time, healing isn't linear. And that is especially true when it comes to our food story, and I thought I was healed, and I'm doing quotes, when I had finished going through your program and I felt I had a community and I was seeing clients and helping them. And then I realized that I had transferred kind of that eating perfectionism onto like showing up perfectly, being an example for my kids, being an example for my community. And it was still a stress. It was still a stress, even though it was in the name of, being an example and being healthy. It was still stressful for me because of all the pressure I put on myself. So I still had work to do, even though I was healed, so my food story is still evolving.
Mm. When you wrote the book, your intention for others was?
My intention is for people, the readers, to change the collective conversation that we, to take away this shame that we have around our eating, you call it eating challenges, our food issues, and to be able to talk about it so that we can heal collectively. Because the conversation, there's the anti-diet culture movement. There's just a lot of conversation that we need to shift for ourselves and for future generations, but also for people to realize they don't have to live with those voices in their head. They don't have to live with the guilt and the shame and the anxiety and the worry and the confusion and the stress, and that we can get back to basics, to what we had when we were born. That once upon a time, we ate when we were hungry, and food wasn't an issue. Food was there to nourish us. Food was our friend. And I feel like we all have that birthright, and I want people to get back to that and trust themselves and their inner wisdom.
Is there any story that comes to mind that you might recall in this moment that would be just a useful example to highlight? Here's what can happen when somebody, whether it was for you, a client, a student, friend, family, loved one, here's what's possible when somebody is able to write, speak, get in contact with their food story, and then start to literally rewrite it. Like what's possible?
I tell a lot of client stories in the book. I mean, I changed the names for, to protect them. But the one that when there were two that come to mind when you were asking the question, I'm like, which one should I tell? And the first one that I'm thinking of is this woman. She had three kids, or she has three kids. And when she came to me, she said, no matter what you do, don't take away. She was very, very rigid with her food. She ate the same thing every day. She measured it. I mean, there was no joy, no fun. And she knew it. And she just said, I'm tired. I'm tired of myself. I'm tired of, how I am around food. I don't know how to break out of this mindset, these habits. And like, just everything was about control. And she said, but there's one time a day at 3:00, I always go to the local coffee shop, and she gets like, not the skinny frappuccino, but like the full blown, with the whipped cream, the whole thing. And it was very uncharacteristic of her. And she said, no matter what you do, please don't take that away from me. Like, that's the one moment I have to myself every day. That's the one moment where it's like my guilty pleasure. And so I was just like, let's not talk about that. That's a part of your day. Let's like work on some of the other things that are bothering you. So a few months into working together, she came to me and she said, I don't want that drink anymore. And I said, oh, why do you think you don't want that drink anymore? And she said, well, I started making those smoothies like we talked about, and like actually sitting down to meals, and, taking breaks in the middle of the day where I put my phone away. So she started taking care of herself. And that one moment at 3:00 was like her rebellious moment, because she never did anything nice for herself, and she just wanted to be bad. And like, and she realized, but when she took care of herself and she loved herself, she didn't have that need to go to the, at 3:00 and go have things that she knew didn't really like feel good in her body. I don't know if that whole story made sense, but it was really, really powerful.
It never ceases to amaze me what happens when we are able to listen to another person's journey, their story, their food story, and how I think, my experience just working with clients, working with students, is that when people have permission to tell their story without having to hide, without, taking away the shame factor and the guilt factor as much as possible. Here's my story. Here's what it's been like. Here's what it is like for me. Here's what you absolutely can't take away. Whatever it is, there's such that by itself is healing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes just the telling of the story, or having either somebody else witness it, or just us ourselves. If I'm writing my own story, my own food autobiography, and I read it, I go, oh, wow, I can just take a step back and see myself differently. I just love that phenomenon.
Me too. And that's why I started my podcast, Once Upon a Food Story. And it's really interesting because I get a lot of people who've shared their story, but I'll ask them like specifics about their food story. And these are people who are, they've been on like spoken nationally, publicly, been on a lot of podcasts. And they'll say to me, I've never shared that before. I've never shared that part of myself. And that always makes me feel like, yes, that's a successful interview, because I want people to open up about what we are feeling called to be secretive about. I don't want that shame. I want us to all realize everybody has their things with food, and when we can start talking about it, it will change our collective story. So
you've mentioned a couple of highlights already that can occur in people's food stories. You've mentioned guilt or shame. You've mentioned in your own story perfectionism. Do you notice any other themes that seem to be more common in people's food stories? Not everybody's, but here's some common themes I tend to see.
I think, well, in chapter 2 of my book, I get into 8 disempowering stories, and they were just, I started writing out what I was hearing over and over again. A couple of them are like the story of later is very common, I think. And that's when, when I have the body I want, or when I can get this whole eating thing right, then I will fill in the blank. And I think a lot of people, especially a lot of people who take care of others, a lot of moms, they put themselves off. They put their own, or they think it's too hard. They don't have the bandwidth to work on themselves. And so that story of later is really common. I also see a lot of like, the all or nothing, or being really eager on a Monday, and then just like the new year, right? And then just making these promises to ourselves that we can't keep. And that's huge in a lot of people's food story. And then with that, comes the disappointment and the, lower self-esteem and confidence that why can't I get this right? So those are a couple of themes that I see over and over again. And I also think that so many people aren't even aware of their inner narrative and the stories that they're telling themselves. So part of the reason why I wrote this book and why I have my podcast and I'm doing the work that I'm doing is so that people can wake up and start to realize what they're saying to themselves over and over again.
Waking up is an interesting way to phrase it, because I so concur with you that oftentimes our food story is just unknown to us,
right?
In a certain way. Like, of course, there's aspects of my food story I'm aware of. Here's what I eat. Here's what I don't eat. Here's what I struggle with. Here's what I'm upset about. Here's what I'm guilty about. Here's what I'm ashamed about. So there's the pieces that I know, and there's the pieces that I don't even realize until the mirror gets held up. And then all of a sudden it's this mini enlightening moment. I just interviewed somebody today on my podcast as a client, and she was sharing how she turns to all these different foods for emotional support. So she's very clear. I eat chocolate, I eat pasta, I eat all these desserts and fatty foods because I feel stressed, anxious, nervous, depressed. So I go for these foods. But now I've been diagnosed with diabetes, and I've been diagnosed with high blood pressure and all these health conditions. So I need to stop eating these foods. And I have a great nutritionist, but I can't stop eating these foods. But I need to stop eating these foods, otherwise I'm going to die. And it's interesting because as we got into her food story, what we sort of uncovered was that on a certain level, she needed those foods because that's the best thing going in her life. The rest of her life, she doesn't like so much. It's not really worth living to her. She doesn't have a lot going for her. And I just said, I think you almost need to eat these foods because that's the highlight of your day. And the way to not eat those foods is to have a life that's worth living. And you could just see the lights come on because she's been in so much therapy and doing so much work on herself. But the work is always, how do I stress manage? Mm-hmm. How do I try to not eat the food? Instead of also including the big picture of her life. And I know that's, part of your work is you're not just rewriting the way you eat, but you're rewriting the way you live.
Right.
And the two are just, they're so beautifully connected.
Mm-hmm. Right. So did you help her find, her passions or things that would excite her in addition to food?
Yes, that was the conversation. The conversation was stop trying to fight the food because it's not working for you. And she's also had a lifetime of depression and no medication has worked and therapy hasn't really gotten her out of it. And so what we came away with was what she really desires deep down inside is to get away from the computer and her computer-based job and work with people in some way, just work
Wow.
one-on-one and be in relationship with people. So we concluded that that's the road to help heal her depression. Just start giving your life away.
That's a huge discovery.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, and it also makes me think of that it's so often not really about the food. Like the food is the symptom, not the problem.
Isn't that true though? It's
Mm-hmm.
and it's a great place to learn about, how we do life, because oftentimes the way we do food is how we do life. So if I'm being perfectionist about food, there's a good chance I'm perfectionist elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm
Yeah.
no, go.
No, I mean, I really relate to that. And so, I hesitate to say I'm a recovering perfectionist because while I healed I definitely don't have that anymore around food. I have freedom in that way. I'm not obsessive about it or worried about it or counting or anything like I used to, but my perfectionistic tendencies have not gone away. Now I see they've transferred into other areas with, my writing or whatever, and so I'm just wondering if you think, does perfectionism, which is a huge theme in my food story, and I think a lot of people, the listeners probably can relate to that. Do you think it ever goes away? Or can you ever say perfectionism is just not part of my life story anymore? I can't say that totally. It's not part of my food story.
I think it's a great question. And for me, a big piece of it is not so much getting rid of perfectionism and saying, okay, I'm a fully recovered perfectionist because I have no more perfectionism anywhere. But I think it's more along the lines of ongoingly transmuting perfectionism so that it works for us. Meaning there's a certain gold in perfectionism. If we were going to look at the positives, I think of perfectionism, it's a desire to do something with skill and a desire to do something that has impact and that's effective and that's pristine. So there's something beautiful about that. And at the same time, it could be deadly.
Right, exactly.
So how do I'm always asking the question, how do I kind of dance with that perfectionist voice in me so that I can let it do its good moves and take from it how it serves me and let go of what doesn't serve me about it. Mm-hmm. So I'm not trying to get rid of perfectionism. I'm just trying to elevate it and transmute it so it's working for me.
Right. So it's just having that awareness, like you're aware it's there, you're aware it's speaking, but then reacting to it in a way that it can serve you and not paralyze you, because it can definitely be paralyzing.
It can be, but it has so much energy and power for so many people. Perfectionism can be so strong. So I'm always thinking, how do I harness that power? How do I help somebody else harness the power of perfectionism so that power is now working for us as opposed to against us?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I think also it's recognizing, okay, stop. Like you don't need to read this for the 127th time or whatever, like I do think that you have to set boundaries with that inner perfectionist.
Oh, 100%. So that's how we harness its energy. Mm-hmm. I mean, harnessing the energy, I don't know, of a dog, you got to put a leash on it. You got to make sure it's not constantly pulling you or chewing on the leash or kind of running in every direction. So yeah, we harness it. The leash is a boundary. And at some point you train your dog to walk alongside you and life is good. You're happy. The dog's happy. Everybody else is happy.
Mine is right next to me. He's so good.
That's so sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. What you were saying reminded me of something I talk about a lot. It's called food. I call it food noise. and that's just, all the messages that are ongoing that we hear, that we're exposed to, that we see, and even like don't even realize that we're seeing it, whether it's scrolling through social media or, just watching television and getting an ad, a magazine. And so it never goes away. We're at least not now. I mean, there are people like you and me who are trying to change this conversation, but there's noise, food noise everywhere. And so the way you express dealing with perfectionism, like being aware of it and conscious of it, but like setting the boundaries is the same thing with food noise, because sometimes you might get a good idea. You might want to be curious and try something new out, right? That you hear about. But if you're always listening to the noise, then you're disconnected from yourself. And that's the same thing with perfectionism, I think.
Yeah. I'm interested in distinguishing out how you talk about and think about food noise. Let me tell you what I hear and just see what it is for you. I know for so many people that I work with, one of the biggest challenges is just the messages that they're getting from media, that they're getting from social media. Sometimes the messages are very clear, which is you're too fat, you need to lose weight, this is what you should look like. And other times the messages are a little more subtle. We don't even realize that when we watch certain movies with cartoon characters that are ridiculously thin, that we're taking in a message. And a lot of people have difficulty. They'll say, I want to love my body more, but there's so many messages out there that tell me not to love my body, that it's just impossible. So those are some of the examples that I often see that people struggle with. And I'm just wondering if you can break it down more, how you define it, how you see it, food noise.
Well, I mean, that's a really good example. And that's so hard because it's sort of a lifetime of being exposed to, what the ideal body, the ideal diet to follow, all of that. And so for me, like even something as simple as getting on my yoga mat and doing things that reconnect me back to my body, because you want to do the opposite. You want to try to get that control back, because what food noise does is it disconnects you from your signals, your inner wisdom. Like that's the term I think you like to use. And from, it just disconnects you from knowing who you are. And so I think that the way to be able to handle food noise, because it isn't going away, is one, to be aware of where it's coming from. And so I have a fun exercise where you go through your day and acknowledge. You don't judge it or anything, just acknowledge, oh, food noise, that's food noise, that's food noise. But then to proactively and actively do things that reconnect you back to yourself. And so yoga was huge for me. Getting on the mat, like leaving everything else behind. It was just me and movement and my breath. And of course, like the teacher, hopefully you don't have a teacher saying anything about bodies and, all those kind of messages. But it was really, really transformative and healing, because I just learned to respect my body so much more. And so I think doing other things, taking a few deep breaths when you hear those messages and reconnecting back to yourself, and, just reminding yourself that, that this is conditioning. This isn't the truth, and I think always questioning, am I believing this because of conditioning, or is it really my truth? And asking yourself to identify and distinguish between that.
I love the way you language that. It's such a powerful distinction, I think, to say and I might be paraphrasing you a little bit here, that how food noise just disconnects us from ourself, from our wisdom, from our body, and it's just. The easy remedy is to reconnect. Anything that reconnects us to our body sort of almost short circuits the noise.
I mean, there's so many other ways. Like we talked about writing. When you're writing and writing out your thoughts, you're getting to know yourself better. So you're really reacquainting yourself with you, and trying to do things that can help you. But I also think taking an inventory of where the food noise is coming from is so, so powerful. Because
Yes.
it's like what we talked about at the beginning of the episode with how you are not aware of your inner narrative. You're also not as aware of these messages that are seeping in because you've been exposed to them probably most of your life.
Who do you notice comes to the table when it comes to your work, whether it's your podcast, your individual work, or maybe if you're able to track who's reading your book? Is it more women? Is it a certain age group? What have you noticed about who's showing up?
Well, okay, so I want to say that the book is definitely written and my message is definitely geared more towards women because I think, I mean, women are continuously, we are fed the messages and also have, a lot of eating challenges and food issues. But when I've looked at statistics, it's women who are, my Instagram follower or community. I don't like to say followers, my Instagram community. And it's mostly women, but there are some men. And I would never, everybody has a food story. And I have 2 sons. So I would never want to say that this is only for women. And I've shared this story with you before, and I'll make a really short version of it. But I had an 80-year-old man, his family came to me, his son actually, and said, I want you to help him. And I was so short-sighted. And I said, I like to myself, I don't know if I can help him. We don't really have he's not my ideal client audience. And then I really just thought it was so beautiful that the son was trying to help him at 80 years old, especially. And so we had a meeting, and right away he talked about how, for 40 years he was been diagnosed with diabetes, and like it's just taken all the pleasure and excitement and joy out of eating because it's always been about what he couldn't eat. And so, he has spent the last 40 years with all his rules. And it was really interesting because I asked him what he wanted to eat, and so I could find him like a more like a friendlier version for him. And I realized like we weren't so far apart. He lived with a lifetime of rules. I had all my own self-created food rules. And so I got it. I understood how he felt around food. And it was just, that was like a really pivotal moment for me in who I can support and who my message is for, because everybody does have a food story.
Everybody eats, yes,
yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. And so I don't ever want to exclude anyone, but I would say that the language and just from my own personal experience, that it's mostly women.
Now, I'm going to assume that what enables someone to write a book that has usefulness and has wisdom in it, particularly on a topic like this, is that along your own journey, you've had your own aha moments, you've had your own breakthroughs, and you've learned. And then you put forth the wisdom that you've learned, that you've kind of discerned, hey, other people might be able to relate to this, because there's certain parts of our food story that's obviously individual to me, unique to you, but there's things that we share in common. So you've had your own aha moments along your own journey. Were there any kind of insights that happened for you just in the writing of the book itself? Things that you learned along the way as part of authoring the book that you didn't realize before?
That's such a good question. Well, my favorite chapter in the book, I did realize this but I just have to give a little shout out. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book. It's chapter 7 called Don't Bring Stress to the Table. And hands down, that was the most pivotal moment, is when I learned as a student at the Institute for Psychology of Eating about the stress response. I had no idea about what happens to our body on a physiological level from our thoughts. And that created such a wake up call for me. And every time I share the story, I always mention you, Mark. And, whenever I do a talk, most of the time when I'm on, other podcasts, I talk about this. I don't know if you probably talked about it so often on this podcast, but
Please.
oh no, just what happens, just that when we're stressed, when we come to the table, and this isn't stress because of life circumstances. This is the self-created stress from, oh my gosh, is this going to make me bloated? Is this allowed? Oh, I should be doing, detoxing and I'm eating this and just whatever, all those kind of crazy thoughts that we have on, a daily basis. When we sit down and eat, those thoughts are creating a stress response, which means that your cortisol goes up and your, digestion isn't as efficient. Your metabolism slows down. Your nutrient assimilation isn't as, you aren't absorbing as many nutrients and you're not getting as much pleasure from the meal. So, something I learned, from you, Mark, and that created the biggest wake up call because I was eating all the things. I was eating the kale and the quinoa and the superfoods and all of that and making it look beautiful and cooking from scratch for my kids. But I was still having those thoughts, and when I understood that, it was such a wake up call. And that was the impetus that I needed to change the way I thought about food. Not just what I was eating. So that was huge. And I talked about it. I've been talking about it for years and sharing it for years, but writing it out reinforced how pivotal it really was. So that was one. And then the other thing is that, and this is kind of interesting, I wrote the book during the pandemic. I started writing it right in the end of 2019. And so when everything kind of happened, in March of 2020, I was chapter 5, chapter 6, and it was before I wrote chapter 7. And I was just like, who is going to care about this book? Who is going to care? People, because this is the beginning, right? And who knew, people were dying and it was just, there was so much unknown and uncertainty, and food felt like it felt stressful in a different way, like food access, food, just there were other issues. And so I didn't know if some of these thoughts, which, am I going to like worrying about being bloated or something like that was really important enough. So I really had to question my whole story, my whole message, everything because of our global circumstances. But the other thing that happened while writing is everything changed in March 2020. So my routine changed, my stress levels went up, and I didn't feel as good physically in my body. Like I just felt not like myself, and which is completely understandable. And I have all these tools, but I just felt bad about myself. Like I just was like, I'm not on my A game. And of course we understand why, but instead of beating myself up, I thought, well, what's the lesson? Something else that I really learned while being a student at the Institute. And the lesson I think was that I needed to be in that like painful space to write the book. I needed to feel uncomfortable in my skin, not be writing it always from a place of I'm healed, I feel good, I have food freedom or whatever, that I needed to be in that pain spot and write from that place to understand my reader. And so that was huge. And I haven't really shared that before, but that was really, and it was huge in two ways. It was huge that I was there, but it was also huge that I could approach it with curiosity and see the lesson and lean into it.
It also sounds like a wonderful way to bury the old boogeyman of perfectionism even more, because, a perfect person would be writing the book from a perfect place.
True.
And perfect emotions, and I'm on top of my game. And a real human being, goes through times that are difficult and times that are messy. And I've always noticed, and I really appreciate you sharing that. One thing I've noticed about human beings is that oftentimes we ourselves might think, oh man, I'm just not on my A game today. I'm not in a good mood. I'm having a bad hair day. Nothing is working inside. But what people are perceiving, people who are we're being with, people who are we're in conversation with, they're not seeing any of that. Right. They're seeing our light. They're seeing our goodness. They're picking up on our essence oftentimes. Like, yeah, okay, sometimes certain people are going to notice, yeah, Elise is a little more down today. But a lot of times we think that the way we're showing up is the way we're telling ourselves how we're showing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense. But everything is energy too, right? So you want to have that. You want to be in a place where you can exude the energy that like that you give off the energy you want to give off.
Yes. And yes. And I think, and also for me, it's refreshing when I can be in a conversation about food or nutrition and we can put the perfect diet and perfect nutritional approach to the side and, and just be real, like, wow, this isn't easy. And talking about food, we're not always going to be on the top of our game. Mm-hmm. My relationship with food it rides its own wave. And that's just very human, I think, because there's so much more that we're all going to experience from now until the time that we die. And it's not always going to be easy. And sometimes it's going to be amazing. It's just everything. The story, as you said, it just has so many twists and turns.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just shows you also that it's not just you and food. There are all these other factors that come into play, and so I think that's really important for people to acknowledge and recognize that, and sometimes everything works in your favor and sometimes it doesn't, but that, there's always a chance to begin a new chapter, always.
Yes. What a lovely message. Really. There's always a chance to begin a new chapter. I find that's such an important affirmation because, I'm sure you've met people who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s who have a challenging relationship with food, who have a challenging story. And there's always time to rewrite it. It's never too late.
Mm-hmm. It's never too late. I agree with that. Yeah, it's good.
So, Elise, I am so grateful for this conversation. I'm grateful for you and your work and your generosity. And how do we stay in touch with you? How do people learn more about your work? Where do we find your book?
So I'm so grateful for you too. And thank you for having me. This is fun because I never would have imagined that I'd be here, having this conversation with you. So thank you. And it's in large part because of being your student. My website is my name, EliseMuseles.com. I have a whole book section there, but my book is available, Food Story, Rewrite the Way You Eat, Think, and Live, wherever books are sold. So you can check your local bookstore or, of course, online. And then on the Sounds True website, they're my publisher. And my podcast is Once Upon a Food Story, and that's wherever you listen to podcasts, and get excited because Marc is going to be a guest soon on my podcast. And I am on social media. I switched from, I used to be Kale and Chocolate, but now I'm my name, which was a huge deal. So you can find me across social media at Elise Museles. Instagram is definitely more my baby. And I think that's it. I've got everything. And then we'll give you a link for a free download for a food mood pantry list, just to start exploring how you can use food to support the feeling how you want to feel. And that's it, Marc. That's, I think I covered it all.
Oh, you only covered a small amount.
Well, I meant where you can find me. We could keep talking about it. I mean, it's so complex and there's lots of different, conversations we could have, but this was really fun for me. And, it was great to share parts of my story too, that I'd never shared. Hopefully it'll help the listeners think of their own.
Well, I'm going to consider this conversation as to be continued. And I so appreciate your time, and congratulations on your work. Congratulations on the book. I know it's a labor of love, and it's truly a wonderful book. I think there's a lack of good reads out there when it comes to the universe of eating psychology, our relationship with food. So yours is right at the top of my list. So great job, Elise.
Well, thank you, Marc. That means so much to me.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. My friends, always more to come. Take care.
Hey friends, we're so happy that you've joined us for another episode of The Psychology of Eating with Marc David. Are you loving these episodes? Then simply subscribe and you'll never miss an episode again. We'd also love it if you'd leave us a comment below so we can hear more about your own journey with food and body. And if you're curious about what we offer at the Institute for the Psychology of Eating, including our internationally acclaimed coach certification training that's rooted in dynamic eating psychology and mind-body nutrition, please head on over to our website, psychologyofeating.com. Until next time, take care. And remember, having the body you want starts with loving the body you have.